Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you very much. We are live streaming this to Aberdeen for the first time. So, hello, Aberdeen. This, of course, as ever, is courtesy of Sir Angus Grossart, who has very generously sponsored the filming of all our talks. And we're delighted to include our Aberdeen fellows in this, and we hope in future we'll be able to do this again and perhaps have much more interaction. But may I call upon the director, Simon Gilmour, to read the minutes of our last meeting.
Good evening, fellows, guests. Minutes of the meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, held at 6 p.m. in the Auditorium, National Museum, Scotland, on Monday, 13th March 2017. David Caldwell, President of the Society, in the chair. The minutes of the last meeting were read and approved. The following communication was read. Medieval Friaries in Aberdeen, by Alison Cameron. The following communication was then read at 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday, the 21st of March 2017, in the Regent Building Lecture Theatre, Regent Walk, Aberdeen. Restoring the Mackintosh Building following the 2014 fire, by Liz Davidson. Jackson Armstrong in the chair.
May I sign that as a correct record of the meetings? Take that as a yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. And do we have any other notices?
Sorry. So I have only a couple of notices. First one is obviously, because we're live streaming and because we're recording this in any case as well, can you please make sure you've got your mobile phones switched either off or to silent? The second thing is that the talk tonight is obviously about Portmahomack, which Martin has written about in one of our more recent books. Just to let you know, we only have 4 copies of that left to purchase online through our website. So if you rush home really quickly, you might beat the people who are watching this live streaming, but I doubt it. And finally, I also wanted to let you know that our most recent book is now on sale on our website as well, or by telephone. A Cromwellian Warship wrecked off Duart Castle, Mull, in 1653 by our fellow Colin Martin. An excellent publication, of course I'd say that, but it is the first full record of a full underwater excavation of a shipwreck in Scotland, so please do get your hands on that as soon as you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. So, over to the main business of the evening. And I'm delighted to welcome one of our honorary fellows to give this evening's talk. Martin Carver hasn't actually got a degree in archaeology, but yet he is one of the most distinguished academic archaeologists of his generation, for long Professor of Archaeology at York and also editor of the distinguished journal Antiquity. He is noted for having carried out some very important excavations, not least the re-excavation at Sutton Hoo, thank you, yes, old age is terrible, isn't it? Sutton Hoo, and with a bit of luck, I'll remember that he's speaking about his excavations tonight at Portmahomack. He has been retired now for several years, but is still keeping up his research interests, not least in a project, Sicily in Transition, in partnership with Alessandra Molinari of the University of Rome. And he says that, like his other projects, like Portmahomack, this one is concerned with what happens to people when a new regime is imposed on them. May I call on Martin to give his talk tonight? Thank you very much.
you very much, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for inviting me. It gives me a good opportunity to say thank you to all the people who have helped to make a success of Portmahomack. I mean, I'm not going to thank them all, otherwise I'd be here like the Oscars all night thanking. But at least I can say how grateful I am to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, who helped us throughout, but especially in getting the research report published. And I think you will agree that they've made an absolutely beautiful job of it. You know, no credit to us. It's really the society that does this. There's a whole suite of these monographs which I think are a monument to the work of the society and to Scottish archaeology in general. Now, I want to press the button. Yes. So I'm going to tell you the story of this excavation and what we and what we found, and then I'm going to try and interpret it a little bit, and then I'm going to show you what I think is significant about its contacts with wider Europe. This is also an opportunity for me to hear a little bit from the community of Scottish archaeologists who you sort of represent, and maybe you have some objections to some of the things that have been said about this site. Maybe you have some ideas and inventive ones. So it's a two-way process, and being invited to give these talks is a great privilege because it means that you meet people you might not otherwise meet, and they will have ideas that you might not otherwise hear. Now, I was, as your president remarked, working at Sutton Hoo on the changes that happened in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century in Suffolk. And I wanted to do a project about the Picts. It started all when I worked in Durham, actually, and I went to do a course on the Picts in Durham, but I was the only person who wanted to do it. And so Rosemary Cramp said, looks as though you're the only one, but there's 3 others, they're doing Anglo-Saxon archaeology. Well, I just left the army, and I know what that means. That means you do what you're told and go to do this other course, which I did. I certainly very much enjoyed it, but it was always a bit of a dream to be able to come back to Scotland and do some Pictish archaeology. We did have objectives that were a little bit like this. The kingdoms that you see here, very vaguely drawn out around the North Sea, were all in a state of formation between the 5th century and the 9th. We know roughly where they are because references are made to them in various kinds of documents. Materially, they don't map anything like so neatly, and part of this is because people move about. The way that people move about has been traced by archaeologists in the past by using artifacts, and particularly artifacts found in graves, and these are usually interpreted as the movement of people. But we had the great good fortune to start this project when the archaeological sciences had progressed in a very interesting way and had started doing research on the biology of individuals who were found buried in cemeteries, which was independent of any artifacts. This biology told you what they ate. It also told you how they'd moved about. And just in parenthesis, that is now another expanding field, because although we were in the era of stable isotopes, from next year we'll be in the era of ancient DNA, which is much more precise about saying where people were born and what happened to them after that. So the basic framework for this type of investigation is to try and find out how we got the countries that we've got today in Europe. And all of them had their origins in this short period, this formative period. Well, that was the idea. But of course, in practice, what happens is rather different, and it's chance that leads you to a place which you then find you have a magnificent opportunity to do something which you didn't really plan to do. And in my case, it was because this site at Portmahomack was in the care of my first cousin's mother-in-law's best friend. And these are the sort of links which create research opportunities, as I'm sure you know. And so she rang me up, that's to say, the trust's chairman rang me up and said, "I hear you're an archaeologist, would you like to come and visit our redundant church?" And so I said yes, and came up. And St. Coleman's Church is there. We had a wonderful reception. We put a project together which was a combination of Highland Council and the Tarbat Historic Trust, the University of York. We put a project application to the Heritage Lottery Trust. And the reason for that, I think, will become fairly clear. We wanted to do an excavation on a sufficient scale so that it would make an impact on the question of how the Pictish kingdom began. That needed a lot of money. We also wanted to throw a certain amount of science at it. That needed a lot of money too. And so this group of institutions, organizations, local people, university people, scientists, got together to see whether this site could deliver the goods. Well, it's a lovely place, and if you haven't been there, it definitely needs a visit. We're looking across the Dornoch Firth in the direction of Sutherland. That's St. Coleman's Church, the white building that you see there. When we first saw it, it was redundant. It had been redundant since 1921, and it had been bought by the Tarbat Historic Trust for £1, on the understanding they would look after it. They wanted to look after it, they wanted to make it, they wanted to refurbish it, they wanted to make sure it stayed standing. They needed money for that. They applied to the usual places for money, but there's an awful lot of redundant churches. And so they were advised, you know, your church is not historic enough. So they said, how do we make it more historic? They said, well, you get an archaeologist, and they'll say anything, you know. So, especially if you pay them. And so I was recruited by Tarbat Historic Trust, and Highland Council showed a wonderful degree of faith in us. And it was Highland Council, actually, that got this whole thing off the ground. Graham Watson was the person, I think, who we should thank. So here's the church. It's being refurbished, and we knew that it had something in it since the late 19th century. Bits of sculpture had been found in its graveyard, and notably this bit, which had insular majuscules in relief with this inscription, the name of Jesus Christ, in commemoration of somebody, unfortunately, who the name isn't complete, but it was clearly some kind of part of some kind of monument, and there were other bits and pieces, as you see here in the churchyard wall, lying about, all generally speaking 8th century, the decorated pieces. And then in 1988, Barry Jones and Ian Keeler were flying around doing their survey of the Murray Lech, and spotted this ditch which goes round the church. At the top, that's the sea there, that's the Dornoch Firth, there's St. Coleman's, here's the ditch. And it resembled the ditch that goes round the monastery at Iona. So people were thinking, Latin inscription, very uncommon in Pictland, circular ditch going round a church. reminds one of Iona. So probably this site is a monastery. Well, I didn't actually go there because it was a monastery. I thought just that was an interesting piece of information that at some stage it had been one. Well, then we did our usual kind of evaluation project to see what had survived in this particular piece of terrain. Sees up here, here's the sand dunes. This represents the depth of strata that we just measured it in the usual way with a small number of trenches. The contour said there'd been a stream down here at some stage, so it's obviously infilling as this land, the glebe field here, is ploughed. And there's our ditch. This area here, very shallow, just 30 centimetres to the natural subsoil. So the next thing was to decide how to investigate the site. We were quite keen to dig where the center of the settlement appeared to be, as indicated by the ditch. We were also quite keen to dig inside the ditch at its furthest extremity, because this is where Chris Lowe had found those interesting agricultural structures at Hodham, so that was a good guide. And then this joins it up to as far as we can get. This is the road here, and after that you're in the dunes. We did do a little dig in the dunes, but didn't produce very much. And then add to that the fact that the deal we made with the Heritage Lottery Fund was to restore the church, some money for that, do the excavation, some money for that, produce the finds, and then make the church into a museum to put the finds in order to give it a sustainable value. So this is very much the Heritage Lottery philosophy. They've got quite a lot of money, but they want to give it to something where the heritage is going to stay useful in a place and has local support. So I'm sure you all know this. So that was our plan. And then we started to investigate the different kinds of terrain in those different sectors. Some very shallow, like here in Sector 1. And we did a lot of this stripping and mapping, which is basically taking off the topsoil and cleaning, with a lot of willing volunteers. And then in other areas here, like Sector 2, it's nearly 1.5 meters of stratification, which I must say we were pretty surprised by. And I can't pretend the evaluation predicted that. But it was the most marvelous discovery. And then in the church, the whole of the inside of the church was removed and refurbished, and we were allowed to excavate as deep as we can go without actually bringing the church down in a pile of rubble. So we had to leave some baulks here, but in there was a marvelous lot of skeletons. And then when the church had been excavated, it was made into a museum and a visitor centre. Here they are doing just that. And here's Prince Charles, being Duke of Rothesay, opening it in 1999. And that's Caroline Shepherd Baron, who was the chairman of the trust. We also left a monument of our own. I expect you know Barry Grove here. Mason extraordinary, turned Pictish sculpture maker. And he carved a replica of the Hilton of Cadboll stone, which is in 2 bits. One bit, the big bit, is here in the National Museum, and the small bit is in a restaurant in Ballantor, just near on the Tarbat Peninsula. And Barry made his own reconstruction of the missing bit before it was found. It's actually quite good. And here is how it's made, all laid out in colour, and then he gradually sort of digs out the lively animals and the beautiful ornamental detail. So here's the depth of stratification in Sector 2. This layer here, this sandy layer here, is the bottom of the monastic workshops. So this is really just a sort of guide to the strata for archaeologists before we get on to actually telling the story. These diagrams you're pretty familiar with, and what they do is tell or demonstrate the story. These are not, these are based on enormous diagrams which have all the context and features in. These are like summaries, but it shows you that stratigraphically we were able to tell a story from the 6th century through to the modern period. In Sector 2, it's mainly here a story of workshops and settlement. And inside the church, it's mainly a story of burials and graves. Don't try and read it, it'll give you a headache, but this is amazingly a summary of the 199 burials that were in there. Without this, it would have been quite difficult, I think, to be able to say what the individuals had experienced in their lifetimes. So this 1,000-odd years is really quite well graduated from one layer to the next. Now, when we have these bodies, here's the little bit of science that I'm offering you. Basically, the people buried in the church in the 6th, 7th century here were buried in kists. In the 8th century, they were buried in graves with stones either side of the head, and they were predominantly all men. And then here in the 14th, 15th century is much more of a profile of settlers, men, women, and children. This is the analysis of the carbon isotopes and the nitrogen isotopes, which gives you a diet by the signature of the isotopes. Here, these monks lived mainly on meat, and the villagers had meat and a great deal of fish. These were not fish-eating monks. And then here we have the movement of people as indicated by oxygen and strontium isotopes. This movement was actually rather unexpected in lots of different ways. The first period here, the first of settlement, the 6th, 7th century, these were some local people and some people from various parts of Britain, East and West Britain. The monks were all local, much to our surprise, and the big influx from the west coast into Pictland was really in the 15th century. So you can see here that on the left-hand side, if you're able to see the writing there, that says where the different people came from. This is their childhood home, as indicated by the groundwater in those areas, which is indicated in turn by the signature of oxygen and strontium isotopes. So it's quite clever stuff, and these are the places that they came from. So in the 5th to 7th century, the first period, they're from Britain. In the monastic period, they're all local, except, curiously, for two people who were from Scandinavia, who hadn't heard that it was going to be the Viking period fairly soon, and they were in the wrong place. And in the 15th century, a very large number of people came in from Western Britain, and this is also the time, of course, when the Mackenzies appear in the eastern areas around here, and so it sort of works quite well. But it's funny, isn't it? Because you go in with these preconceptions. Well, we know the Picts and the Scots become Alba in the 9th century, so that should be the time when we see lots of people coming in from the west. Well, we didn't, but we did see them coming in the Clan period. And then radiocarbon dates aplenty, absolutely vital in any modern excavation, and we are particularly spoilt in Scotland because historic Scotland gives you almost as many radiocarbon dates as you could wish for, and we are the envy of all the rest of the disunited kingdom. So we've got quite good date brackets using this other kind of Bayesian analysis tells us a much more precise margin for the dates using the fact that our samples are stratified, so we know the order they're in. All of that then gives you the basis of the story, and since most of us like to read stories in chapters, we tend to divide our excavation sequence into phases or periods, and this does work quite well. So this first period here, 6th, 7th century, is some kind of an elite center, which I will give you some description of in just a tick. Those people either abandoned or more likely gave their land away to the monastery, which came in the 8th century. It was a very short-lived monastery, roughly from 680 to roughly 810, 820, the long 8th century. Now, this is increasingly a result from the monastic sites that have been investigated in the Celtic areas particularly, which is where most of the monasteries are. The English actually haven't got that many in the early period. So here then is what happened next. The monastery was raided, and then the site recovered almost immediately and became a trading farm. Then there was a hiatus, and then the medieval village started slowly to develop round what had been the monastic church, which one assumes was still there as a ruin to attract refoundation. So let's have a look at these, and I will go through fairly quickly, and but please do ask if there's anything you'd like to know more about, and I'll try and answer that. Okay, so this first period has three elements in it. First of all, it has a cemetery, then it has a settlement, and then it has a cultivated area at the south end. These are the graves that belong to the 6th, 7th century. The kist burials, they're well known in Scotland. Long kists, slabs of stone along the side of the skeleton. Sometimes there's a roof, sometimes there's a floor. They were situated they were found on the places where we were digging, but in fact they seem to be spread all over this area here. Now, you probably make out that there are some circles here, and one or two of these got excavated by us, and they appeared to be shallow ditches of the kind you get round a little barrow. And in one case, we had a kist grave with one of these rings around it. So the reasoning was that this was actually a barrow cemetery, not a square one, but a round one. And the dates of these graves, skeletons, was 6th, 7th century. The settlement was firstly dedicated to managing the water. It was a valley, a little burn trickled down it. It was all marshy. And they had wells and cisterns. And there was a hut there with a hearth, and that hearth was not just a domestic hearth, but a hearth for smelting and casting bronze. And in the south area, these are the crop marks here, cut by the first of the monastic boundary ditches. So they're earlier than the monastic ditch. There were plough pebbles, and this looks a bit fuzzy from here, but it's a ditch with a timber lining, which was full of rye and wheat and barley that had been burnt. So this is a farming establishment, certainly, and it also manufactures objects of bronze. Okay, there's a lot missing. Obviously, one would hope that for a hall or something like that to go with this. It looks a little bit like first phase Whithorn, which also had a phase which appeared to be dedicated to agriculture with a little bit of metalworking and some burials. Peter Hill felt that it was a monasteria, some sort of monastic establishment. I didn't feel that it was, and I didn't feel this was either. I think our monastery, at least, sprang fully armed in the next phase. This is what they were making, iron pins, dress pins, and this is a gilt bronze disc which comes from a horse's bridle. These are similar ones. That one is from Sutton Hoo, very satisfyingly. This is from Dunnad, and this is a mould from Motivmark. So from these small number of finds, but significant finds, one can, I think, imagine an equestrian class which is operating all through Britain. For me, this is a really important result, although we could do with a lot more evidence. It's a strong hint that in the 6th, 7th century, there were people who knew each other, who were trading, who were connected, and they were basically upper class people who rode horses. Now, it seems likely to me that these small lordships, and you may well be familiar with the same thing in Wales and in the Borders and in the western part of Scotland and so on. Mainly they're on forts, they're on hills, forts on hills, but they give way in the north and the west to what I am describing in various writings as the monastic movement. See, I don't think that when Christianity came to Britain, they brought monasteries with them. I think there was a long pause of about 75 years between the time Augustine arrived and the time monasteries took off. But when they take off in Northumbria, Scotland, Pictland, Wales, and Ireland. That's where it happens. You can't find sites like this in England, even though the English like to think they have monasteries in the 7th and 8th century. We haven't found any that are at all convincing, at least not that look like these. So it's a very powerful movement, and it's characterized by a lot of sculpture and a lot of extremely grand sculpture as well, particularly the sculpture that comes out of Northumbria. So I think this is something new. It wasn't really so much discovered by Portmahomack, as I think it was discovered by the people who assembled the corpus of Anglo-Saxon sculpture, but it hasn't really emerged from there very clearly as a strong storyline in the history of Britain, and I think it should. So the view is that our elite settlement handed over the land, as Bede records in many cases, and here is what they built. First of all, they adapted the cemetery, and then they built a road, that's to say a paved road, and then either side of it there was some craft developing. There was a dam here which created a big pond. This is the stream coming down here. And then at the end of this there is a building, this strange looking building, and metalworking, and then the enclosure ditches which enclose the whole thing. We only have a sample, but it's quite an interesting sample, and it's quite an active sample. And in case I forget to mention it, you cannot excavate in the churchyard, because although we have permission to excavate in the churchyard, as you probably know better than I do, you can't excavate in a Scottish churchyard because nobody can give permission except for those that own the layers, the heritors. And so we didn't excavate there because it wasn't possible to excavate there. So in the church, this is the kind of grave that is developed. Stones either side of the head support burials we call them, or head box if they've got a stone over the face. They're in rows. Where it says period 1 burial mounds, this is part of that barrow cemetery that I mentioned in the previous phase. So it's budding off from there, and here are the rows of graves. The two people from Scandinavia are in the rows. So they too think they're monks. They're not simply people who wandered in a boat. They belong to the community. And here, at this end, you can see that the angle of the graves changes ever so slightly, and the alignment is more like the alignment of the end wall of the crypt, which is the clue we had that there ought to be a church here. We haven't found it, but we've got better evidence than this that it exists. This church, St. Colman's Church, predicted as being a medieval building by Geoffrey Stell many, many years ago, was indeed exactly that. And the medieval building had incorporated into it a lot of sculpture. And some of it we removed, and here we are busy removing it using some macros. So this piece was discovered by feeling into between the stones, which were just bonded with clay in the crypt. And then up underneath the stone, you can feel sort of regular lines of carving. So there was a pretty good case for a big piece of stone, which we'd like to see. And there it is. So it's a lovely discovery, and as you can see, it's been masoned to fit with something else. It shows us these Peltaic ornament. This beastie is sitting here in the angle between these fields. It's a very fierce animal. It's got a serpent's head on its tongue, a serpent's head on its tail. It's got claws. It's got hooves. It's got fangs. It's pretty well purpose-built for anything, and it's guarding a cross. I'll show you that in just a tick. So inside the church, there were quite a lot of bits of sculpture produced. Outside the church, we started finding bits of carving, like this, and there was a period of 3 weeks when everybody on the excavation was digging up works of art. This was the result of the Viking raid, which more presently, where after which they broke up pieces of sculpture and then put them down as hardcore. So we were really digging a big layer of broken sculpture. All the bits were scattered, and by getting them to conjoin, we were able to see how scattered they actually were. And by conjoining them, we got some clue as to what kind of monuments had been broken up. And this is an example of, well, much enlarged, example of a holy face. This type of expression is quite well known in insular sculpture. A holy person is far-seeing, and they have these special big eyes which can look beyond this world into the next. So here we are in the National Museum, trying to put the bits together. I think pottery is easier, personally. The big lumps. But there were quite a few successes. So very many different kinds of things, lots of small grave markers, like these. The top of a sarcophagus, a lid of the sarcophagus with some fine animals there. And this is our most important piece, which came up in 3 different bits in 3 different parts of the site, but they all joined together. It's got a flat top, and it's got this head with crisscross hair and far-seeing armoured eyes looking down. So it's a corbel of some description. Now, corbels aren't really meant to be this early. The examples the parallels we found were like sort of 11th, 12th century in places like Marles in the Alps, but this one is well stratified. It is stratified in a layer that can't be later than the 9th century and should have belonged to a church. It's the best clue we've got that there was a stone church at Portmahomack. And this is a sculptor's chisel, which also was found. Nice find to have. So some of these things go together and produce familiar scenes like the Pictish beast, the elephant here. And this piece that we hoiked out of the crypt, on its other side, this is its other side. It's just the way it was photographed and make it look like it's a completely different stone, but it is actually the other side. And here are some apostles, because they're holding books. And they're apostles rather than evangelists, because this one is St. Andrew, who has mad hair, and that's how you know it's St. Andrew. Basically looks like Billy Connolly, so yes, St. Andrew, that's who it is. And then up here we have lions who are confronting each other over half a carcass of a deer. That's what this is. There's a bear slouching. Well, there's been some very interesting sort of interpretations of this, and I won't add to them. But I would say that we can position this here, create this cross, and this is the inscribed stone, which also fits it. So that inscribed stone becomes part of this cross. This piece of sculpture belongs to the monument that commemorates the person of whose name we only have the first four initials, first four letters, rather. And if the apostles are in number 12, or even if they're 6, you get quite a long, tall monument like this, reconstructed. Well, there are other big bits of sculpture in the churchyard, and we know where they are. We know where they were found. So, with a little bit of conjecture, we can place them at various points around where the church probably was. So this picture of a church with crosses around it is really evidence that converges, but is heavily influenced by what an Irish monastic establishment might look like at the time. And so in the fullness of time, somebody might well dismantle this whole picture. But as it is, I think it's a reasonable piece of model building. Well, down beside the church in the valley, here is the road. It's paved. It was paved. It was paved with quite big slabs of stone, which had mainly rotted away. Here is the a bridge with a gully going across it, stone-lined gully going across it. Here is the pond. Here is the dam. And on this side of it was the Vellum workshop. The Vellum workshop was deduced by Cecily Spall, a co-director, with great ingenuity from large numbers of pebbles, which she started to assiduously collect, even though there were a few pebbles in the natural. These were all scattered around or in clusters. These bones, metatarsus of cattle, had been sharpened, so they'd been used as pegs, stone rubbers, pumice stones, curvy knife, other kinds of knives. All of these look as though they belong to some leatherworking, and then you advance the argument by finding that there's a tank, a stone-lined tank here, which was emptied, and that's this is a building here, and lots of ash. And the ash came from burning seaweed, and seaweed had in it lots of little calcareous shells, and so the effect of burning this seaweed was to produce a lot of very alkaline ash, and this is what was used instead of lime in order to cure hides, which mustn't be brown but white. So then, consulting a few parchment people, and they showed how you do it and how you cure the cure the hides and then stretch them on a frame here. You have to stretch them with thongs of leather, but you can't just put them through a hole in the hide. If you pull then, it just opens up into a great big gash. So you wrap the edge of the hide round a pebble, and then you whip it with the thong, and then attach the other end of the thong to a peg here. Then you tighten the pegs, and you gradually get something as tight as a drum. It's the same way a drum works. And as it gets tighter, you shave it, rub it, and make it more and more able to bear the job of writing. So that was the argument. It seems to be holding out still. And here's a diagram showing how vellum is prepared. It obviously relies on having calves. It's that kind of vellum. It's not parchment, it's not sheepskin. We have an enormous number of cattle bones that dominates the assemblage, particularly the monastic assemblage. Cattle are not simply good to eat, they're also an item of wealth. The monasteries were almost certainly relying on this kind of wealth because there was no coins, there's no money here. They need some way of making exchanges, and that way appears to be using the hides of the cattle. So this is, again, an idea that the hide has quite a big literature in early medieval Britain. Anglo-Saxons also measured things in hides. And they do seem to have been used quite recently in, well, say, 19th century California. They used cattle hides as an item of currency. It's called Californian banknotes, and that's what you used to purchase land. So it's as though jumping several hundred years, we're getting back to what can be used, what's not going to rot once it's cured. Of course, in the early medieval period, cattle hides were used for all sorts of things, like jackets and boats and so on. So they had use as well. It could be spent, so to speak. Some manuscripts. Here is Lindisfarne Gospels. Here's Kells. Here is the piece of carved stone from Portmahomack, whose paleography is somewhere between Lindisfarne and Kells, and that's why it's given a date of about 750. Well, go further south, and one can see where the metalworking happened. It was mainly in this building. This is a building consisting of a series of very symmetrically spaced posts, and then quite a narrow stone wall. That's been interpreted rather like Bornesh is interpreted, or following them really, with a turf jacket. So this is not so much a porch as a way through the turf jacket. Here's the turf jacket going around there. And then this this wall rivets the inside of the turf wall. These posts are really beautifully symmetrical, and the building itself looks so strange, but in geometric terms, it's really a trapezium joined to a semicircle. So architecturally, I suppose it's a bit like one of these things in the Highland Folk Museum. I think they did use this kind of building technique, in other words, stone and turf, stone and turf. I'm not sure we've really got it in that building, but that's the idea. I don't know whether that building could stand up. I shall have to consult the Geddes family after the lecture. But I think it's a most amazing concept. This picture here shows you where all the metalworking debris was found inside the house, and the blue is animal bones, and these animal bones have been used for fuel. These are the so-called bone coal, where the animal bones provide a very a very high heat for melting metal. So here are some bits and pieces, molds, bits of glass were made, some sort of studs, more studs, and this is a cupellation dish for separating silver from lead. There is not a huge amount of it, but there's plainly been a workshop, and they must have been making things a bit like this. We didn't find these, but this is the Derry Flank pattern, monastic reliquary, Ardagh chalice. These have all got little studs or moulded areas. A really rather exciting collection. So vellum making precious metal of making vessels, making the sort of precious metal vessels which are used in the Mass, and then making sculpture. This is what this was about as an industrial area at Portmahomack. Big stones stood there, and at Hilton, Shandwick, and Nig, and this map is meant to indicate to you that these stones stood in positions which looked out over different parts of sea. So, as in the case of the Irish monasteries with their lector and their stations around the edge of islands like Inishmurray, so in Tarbat we think that we could see these great big stones acting as sea marks as well as probably points of pilgrimage and worship. So here is the back of Ewan Campbell studying the Shandwick stone, and here it is without its glass box that it has now. Quite a beautiful, absolutely beautiful stone, probably the finest, I think, anywhere. So monasteries, where do they come from? They do spring up fully armed, and they spring up fully armed in the Celtic area. But clearly, they don't all work in exactly the same way. And what this analysis tries to do is to show you where all the different aspects of monastic attributes, if you like, where they come from. Part of it is clearly from the Mediterranean, i.e. the Christian story and writing, probably water mills as well. A lot of the iconography, no one's arguing with any of these things. But then other things, kissed graves, thought to be Christian for some time, I think now are pretty well firmly rooted in the previous Iron Age. The layout, it isn't really, I mean, it's monastic in Ireland and in Scotland. It's curvilinear, but what it most resembles is prehistoric sites. Standing stones, well, prehistoric. They are very much part of the language of this monasticism. Even things like perambulation, Thomas de Carrigoin has suggested, are part of the prehistoric routine, and some of the very same places, in fact, are the sites of pilgrimages long before the birth of Christ. And other kinds of analysis that have been done. The cult of relics has been looked at by Parker Pearson, all sorts of other people. There seems to be a Bronze Age cult of relics, an Iron Age cult of relics. It's something that seems to be sort of in the DNA before the arrival of the new style cult of relics from the Mediterranean. Ben Clover has argued, Nathaniel Ben Clover has argued that the tonsure that everyone argued about in Synod of Whitby there was a difference because there were holy men in Britain before Christ, and these holy men had a special kind of haircut which is recorded, and that cut is the same as the Druids are shown having, and so on. So there's a lot more research to do on this, but the point I'm trying to make is that these are intelligent people who have agency, who are drawing ideas, who are adapting where they don't have the raw materials, who are brewing up seaweed so that they can make vellum and so on. They are, if you like, not just recipients of ideas, but highly inventive in themselves. So the monastic movement is of huge importance to this part of Britain, and Portmahomack was very much part of it, not a poor relation, but an active agent. And then the Vikings come. Here they are in their boat. They are raiders to start with, and then maybe traders, maybe settlers, depending on where they are. The Norse like the north of Britain and the west coast of Britain. The Danes like the east of Britain. And here there was a raid from somebody, okay? And it was dated by quite a lot of different kinds of dating to about 780 to 810. The red here shows where the buildings had burnt down. They were burning very, very, very hot, and they'd scorched the sand. So there was no doubt that it was an incendiary occasion, at which point you can say, yes, okay, well, things burn down, particularly workshops, they're always burning down. That's true. But on the other hand, what then happened was that the sculpture was broken up and dumped. I think that's a bit more deliberate, and somebody's done that with the destruction of that symbolic set of monuments in mind. And we also had death by blade cuts in 3 people. So, you know, these are the kinds of convergent evidence that one is perhaps looking for. I think what was most interesting was that this recovered so fast. So on the ashes, covered in bits of broken sculpture, almost immediately developed a colony of metalworkers. These metalworkers used precisely the same methods of casting bronze as their monkish predecessors, and may even have been the same people. But they were not making sacred vessels. They were making buckles. They were making brooches. They were making, if you like, a secular repertoire. And most significantly, I think, they were making these bronze weights. These are the molds. And they're very difficult to find any parallels, but the people working in Kaupang say they have found something similar. It's like a sort of acorn-shaped bronze weight, which you use on a weighing machine, you know, to weigh out bits of metal. So it's like a sign of trade rather than a sign simply of manufacture. Well, this period, the 9th century, 10th century in Scotland, I think is absolutely fascinating, sort of 9th to 11th. It's one of those kinds of bits of history which has been sort of wholly taken over by English historians. So we hear a lot about Alfred and the Danes, but we don't hear that much about Macbeth and the Norse. Well, I agree that the problem is that we don't have an equivalent of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which gives you a blow-by-blow account of the battles. But the little we do have does suggest that Macbeth and his peers, and also the Picts, were fighting furiously for nearly 100 years. And they did succeed in the sense that all this part of Scotland didn't really become Scandinavian. And so I think there's lots to find. It's more of a dark age, really, than the 7th, 8th century, and a very exciting place for more research. Well, just to finish with this monastic business and what happened to it, there is a clear sign here of some kind of transition from an elite cemetery settlement to a monastery to a trading place. And I've tried to sort of dig it out of the reports of other monasteries that have been investigated. But one has to bear in mind that many of these sites were extremely well done, extremely well dug, but they didn't, they weren't expecting to dig a series of settlements. And in fact, most of the time, we're not given that opportunity because there's one bit that we can excavate because it's threatened, and that one bit won't have all the settlements in it. But for what it's worth, when they've been done on a big scale, burials are found, and then monastery is found, and then the monastery appears to move on to some other phase. Jarrow is probably the most revealing parallel, and one of the ones that was dug on a bigger scale. So very briefly, I just want to throw some of the medieval site at you. Basically, it had three periods. First of all, the church, and this is the sequence of churches. What a wonderful opportunity we had to dissect a whole church from the beginning to the end. Right to 1921, in fact. It was most brilliant. And this church is so sensitive to what's going on in the world. It's not just, oh, well, it's a church, we know what that is. Actually, it was much more than that. It's more like a theatre in which the scenery kept shifting as ideas kept changing. So this, too, was a theatre of transition, a theatre of ideological change. In the 13th century, the residential and industrial part of the medieval settlement came back to the area in which we were digging. They were fishing. These are big piles of shells and fish bones, these things here, there. And then in the 15th century, they turned their attention to making lots of iron, and we had some tinkers. They don't seem to come out very well, sorry about that, but we had lots of tinkers' waste as well. This is not by any means confined to Portmahomack. It seems to be a quite interesting thing that happens in 15th century Scotland. This is quite fun, though. I thought you might like to see this, the so-called six-headed chieftain. So it didn't actually have six heads. It was a body of a largish, well, quite big, sort of 6'3" man. He came from the west of Scotland and was buried in prime position, just opposite the steps of the crypt, which was there then. And he had 4 skulls placed either side of his head, all looking towards his feet. Well, that was, and he died from sword wounds. And then somebody came in and dismantled this grave and took his head away and put it on one side. And then a new person was laid on top. So he still had 5 heads, but one head was a new head. And then the old head was chucked in at the bottom. And then there was a 6-month-old infant buried at the top. So now this skullduggery is waiting for its author. And what we require here, in fact, I can see a whole TV series building of this one is wonderful period. I mean, if only Walter Scott were alive, you know, I mean, he'd love it. Such a potential interesting drama. So the Tarbat Peninsula starts off as a place known for its prehistoric burial clusters, and then those prehistoric burial clusters attract big monuments in the Pictish period, and by the Middle Ages there are lots of chapels and castles which mark it's a lovely piece of land. It's got enormous character, lots of different view sheds going in different directions. So I think the Tarbat Peninsula itself, we weren't able to do justice to it, but I think it's also really got a lot of history still to deliver. Well, I've mentioned these monasteries and in perhaps rather an obsessional way, but I do think they are interesting in that their power has been underestimated by economic historians. I think historians of Christianity are very well aware how important they are. But I think it's this question of not just wealth, but competitive wealth. This is Joachim Henning's analysis of where the archaeological evidence for production is. This is nearly always metal production, because that's what survives pretty well. And this is referring to mainland Europe. So in this period here, in the 8th century, there is this enormous peak where the monasteries have drawn into themselves a lot of the most important production. And Henning describes this as a major factor in the economic development of Europe. And I'm sure that is worth taking into account. But I suppose my point really is that Portmahomack, which is in many people's minds a long way from anywhere, is itself a barometer of events that are taking place in Europe. It's not everywhere the same, of course it isn't, but these kinds of archaeological analysis which explore transitions, particularly in big sites with deep stratification, these are the windows which open on what for me is more than just happenstance. This is a sign of processes that are happening in Europe as a whole. The switch in ideological emphasis from elite fortified family centers to putting faith in the monasteries and their spiritual power. The agenda changed by the Vikings so that now wealth creation is the most important thing. Not always the same everywhere, but a definite trend. And if one was able, as an archaeologist, to put one's energy into discerning these sequences, these transitions in different parts of Europe, I think we'd have a whole new history, and a history which told us a lot about the people who don't have history. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Carver. There's now an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. If you would just wait for a microphone to be brought to you before you speak, that would be very helpful. So, who have we got?
You had a nicely graphic modern interpretation of an invading Viking galley, and no surprise of your description of the havoc they wrought. It seemed to be their trademark for quite some time. So there's no surprise really then to find so much evidence on site of breaking up the lovely sculpture that you managed to unearth. Why then did they go on to not just destroy it, but to scatter it around the site as a deliberate act? Were they trying to make a point here, the Vikings?
Am I still attached? Yeah. I think that the different kinds of interpretation vary depending on which day of the week it is, because it sometimes one feels very sort of practically minded. A practical-minded person says, well, it's pretty obvious. The ditches which drained the top area where the workshop was had been filled in because the sculpture, broken sculpture, was tipping into there as well. And so they needed the hardcore. In order to sort of get going again, they had to make some kind of level platform. In ideological mood, one tends to say, well, obviously they wanted to scatter this power and make sure that it was eliminated, and so they were tipping it out of the central area, which presumably was occupied. We didn't dig there, but presumably that was then occupied by whatever authority succeeded the monastery and chuck all this stuff away. But on the other hand, they didn't, because some pretty big lumps were left in the churchyard until the 19th century. So I think probably a practical explanation may be what we're looking for here. It was all broken up into quite hand-sized lumps, you know, and you have to be pretty vindictive to solemnly break up a whole cross shaft into small lumps, unless you were going to use it for something else. So that's my guess. There's a pond, of course, there, which is starting to become filled in and terrestrialized, I think they say about these things. Is that worth? Yes. Okay. Just throw it. She can catch. She's good.
Thank you. Martin, how typical do you think Portmahomack was as a monastery? And if it wasn't typical, why do you think it's where it is? How do you explain the context of it?
Right, yeah, I think it was typically in some ways, not in others. So typical in the sense that I think there are lots of other monastic establishments all around the Moray Firth. And in fact, we went to Portmahomack on the basis of about 4 pieces of broken 8th century carving. Now, there's probably 20 or 30 places like that all around the Moray Firth, and Isabel Henderson listed them when she was doing her book on the art of the Picts. And they make a very interesting map. You put them all on there. They're nearly all on the coast, not all, but nearly all on the coast. And some of them are clustered and so on. And so I think, yes, if you unleashed archaeologists in the same way at Editon and right the way up the coast to what's it called, Latheron, places like that, just a little suggestive piece of stone, not too much, that's just enough, and then excavate. And I think you'll find quite a lot of these places. However, there are certain things that indicate to me that Portmahomack had a role as a kind of node, and that is indicated by the fact that they were obviously making more vellum than they needed, and they were making more precious vessels than they needed. So one visualizes that the way that these movements expanded was you founded a monastery, it grew, it became successful, people gave it lots of cattle so it could grow again, it acquired more land, and then with the important equipment, a codex, a chalice, a pattern, and then a stone carver, because you've got to mark out the new site. You sent the expeditionary force off, and they make another daughter settlement, and then there's another, and then there's another. And I think that process was much, much bigger than we know as yet. I think we just got little hints at it. So yes, I think there was a hierarchy. It was the first among equals. It was the first amongst the ones that it supplied or founded. But there's more of them to come, definitely. Oh, the thing.
Jackie.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Okay.
Lovely, thank you. If we accept your theory about the large stones being landmarks for ships out at sea, that's fine, but they clearly, to act as landmarks, they don't need the level of detail that have been carved onto them.
No.
So they must have other purposes as well.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you wanted to talk about that just for a moment.
Well, I'm not an expert on art history by any means, but the idea of the sea marks is that they're long and tall, and they can be easily seen because they're cresting above the skyline, depending on where they originally were. But only Shandwick really is convincingly in the place that it originally was in. So, but bearing that in mind, it's overlooking a beach. Portmahomack overlooks a beach, so it's got a landing place as well. I think it's not just, oh, that's interesting, there seem to be crosses all around here. It's more, that's what we want to aim for, and that's where the landing place is. So I think that can be useful in that sense. What do they actually do with them? Well, some people think that each of the places where these big cross slabs were was itself a monastic establishment of some size or other, or perhaps like a farm for a medieval monastery, something like that. That's a possibility, certainly. They coincide with prehistoric burial grounds, seemingly. And I think, therefore, they do have a very strong ritual presence. The most imposing thing is the cross. So a very, very large cross. And then the cross has with it iconographic messages. It has symbols, it has ornament, all of which is a language which is easily interpreted or easily read by monks, and increasingly probably by everybody else as well. And then on the other side, we have the picture symbols. And the picture symbols, well, the theory, Ross Sampson's theory that these are spelling names seems to me quite a good theory. So for some people, these are the names of the donors. They're rich people, they're kings. I'm not so convinced of that. I'm quite taken with the idea that although the four big monuments of the Tarbat Peninsula are all different from each other, they're all very similar in date. And yeah, you can sort of dream up an idea where there are four different patrons, each paying for a particular cross. But then there is the iconography of the more secular scenes on the back of the cross, the people fighting and hunting on the back of Shandwick, the lady with the hounds on the back of Hilton, and the activities on the back of Nig, which are quite complicated, but seem to involve King David. So there is there's a sort of a bit of a sort of secular flavour, if you like, about these images. And for many people, they are, for a lot of the best art historians, I should say, they are themselves images drawn from Christian thinking and Christian stories, the Bible and so on. They're not meant to represent local people. And some people, notably late Leslie Alcock, had trouble with this. He thought, well, why are they so good in that case? You know, why aren't they more Roman looking, or why don't they look imported? Why do they look so local? And you can square this circle with the idea that they are basically iconographic presentations of holy people, but done in a local way. And they may be, so for me they're saints, and for me these are hagiography. That's what these stones are doing. And that's why I like the way that they're placed all around the peninsula, in the way that they do in Ireland, and they mark out this sacred area. You know, I think that's quite evocative. But if these were saints who we don't know about, they may have been holy people, you know, or fictitious holy people who had been involved in the foundation of the monastery. Monasteries are good at, you know, writing history for themselves, and in many cases it's us who are ignorant, and in other cases, you know, they are bigging up some early missionary and so on. So all these things are possible. It's not obvious what particular piece of hagiography is represented, for example, by Hilton. It's not obvious, no, but that's because we don't have the story. But if some holy woman was converted while out hunting, you know, then you've got something that everyone would recognize. So I know this is spinning a yarn, and it's if, but it's puzzling, and it's interesting, and they're so beautiful, and the amount of investment that's gone into these just doesn't figure with me as being just something that would happen anyway. You know, I think they've laboured to set the precinct out and mark it with stones. And if you were doing that in the Middle Ages, you'd have the Virgin Mary and St. Mark and so on. Each saint would be guarding a different piece of the island. So I'd rather do that than have these labelled with some lord about whom we know nothing at all. So that's a case for the... So somebody's going to say, you must be joking.
Thank you very much. On two of your maps, you showed that there was a great area of reclaimed land on the west of Portmahomack and also in the Nig Bay, which seems to suggest that it was actually a very narrow finger peninsula.
Yes.
How high would it have been above sea level and how safe?
Well, the definition of the peninsula as more of a peninsula than it is now came from two things, really. The works done by Fern Abbey when they arrived, they seem to have imported a lot of soil and constructed a channel and driven a mill with it. So that's 12th century. That's what happened in the 12th century. Therefore, the previous landscape could have been quite different to that, or it could have been narrower. I think bogginess is probably what we had in those reclaimed areas more than anything else. And even as late as the 16th century, it's described by Leyland as a sort of black moor that you have to pass over to get to Fern Abbey from Nig Bay. The idea is that if you raise if you go to the 10-metre line and then draw that, then you've got what a 10-metre sea level would look like, or 10 metre higher than now sea level would look like. So it's pretty notional, I should say. But on the other hand, these other little hints suggest that this land was quite boggy and quite boggy now, actually, and therefore it was more of a peninsula, more of a nearly an island than it is today. That's what I suppose I'm proposing.
One last comment or question, both? Yes, Robert.
I'm afraid it's gruesomely predictable. Coming back to the reclaimed land, the whole Portmahomack thing, Portmahomack is a backward curving spit with very easy access from the sea, but very nice protection from your ship once you get in. And it's the sort of place where you can imagine lots of little houses like the later Shetland Lodbrys along the shore in the fashion of all the paintings of Cowpang. Has anybody thought, and this is really a steer for the nice people at HES, has anybody thought of doing any sort of geophysical survey across the reclaimed land sand dune to see if there's anything that might fit into that pattern for either, I mean, it would be nice to have a Scottish Roskilde.
Yes, or even a Easter Ross Skara Brae. But the main problem with the dunes is that it's a bombing range. As soon as the beach is actually the only dune area where you can go and swim, but still being to be deafened by bombing because the whole of the inlet there at the end of the Dornoch Firth is a big bombing range which is very actively used. So I don't, and the other shore is rocky, as you know. So I think that would be it's certainly a hunt worth doing, but if I had the opportunity, I don't think I'd go there. I'd go to Berg Head. I think that would be the beach I'd look at with my radar. I'm sure there are houses there, absolutely, buried in the sand. But nothing's impossible. All these sites have fantastic potential.
Well, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your thoughts and comments and questions, and particularly to Martin Carver. That word reclaim is perhaps an interesting one to use, because Professor Carver has in fact reclaimed a great deal of interest in that Pictish period in Scotland, in the development of monasticism, and put it in a very wide and intriguing this is a bad night, isn't it, for I'm losing my vocabulary. Context, that was the word I was looking for. Better wrap up quickly. You've got to know. And he's presented his talk in a very entertaining and interesting way. And we're very grateful to him for that. So let's thank him in the usual way. Thank you very much, Angus.